Okay, so I got all these formers situated and the stem done, and I sheeted the top. You can see this is a centerpiece I put in here just to tie this bow stem in place good, and then I cut a piece for this curve, and then I flipped it over and cut another piece, so there's two pieces, so they're both the same. And then I put a piece of number 138, 30 thou by 188, the first top plank, basically, but this is all steel, bear in mind. So I just welded that in with solvent, so it's nice and solid. And what I'm going to do here is just use a thin sheet of like 20 thou and just sheet the whole side in at once. And then I can bend it in. And then I'm going to sheet it again with some 10 thou or something. I'm not sure, but I want to create a bit of a weld, a little bit of a texture there that shows that the hull was welded. And then I'll just do the same, just use this template, which should work pretty good on both sides. And that'll get the front part sheeted in, okay? Okay, so remember how I talked about doing distressing on plastic and all the different ways and methods there are if you use your imagination? Like, for example, here's a piece of scrap plastic, I think is 40 thou, and I just glued some strips of number 218 20 thou rod, just like ribs, okay, like on the outside of it. And now I'm going to lay on a piece of 5 or 10 thou, super thin. This is actually 5 thou, and for the life of me, I don't know where I got it. I think it's evergreen, but it's been in my stash for a long time, and I haven't seen it lately. But anyway, so I take it, and once again, I stroke it one way a couple times so that you don't buckle it. And then just take some solvent, like, okay, and just flood a good amount on, about halfway or so. Okay, now just lay this right over top like sheet metal. Okay, and just work it in. You can even use a little tool like this. This is a little sculpting tool. It's got a sort of a shoe, a curved shoe on it with a point, and you can and there you can see how that creates a ribbed effect, see? Okay. That's what I'm going to do on this hull. You can see I've made marks right here. And I'm going to resheet it with 5 thou so that I have that look. Because on this tug, the front, you can see it. The ribs behind it. I mean, obviously I'm not going to model that many ribs, but I can simulate it on the outside of this 15 thou skin and then cover it in 5 or 10 thou to finish, like this. Okay? Okay, so I just want to show you this here. So I'm making marks along the waterline. This is sheeted now with 15 thou. Okay, it's not perfect, but you don't want it to be anyway. This is why a tugboat is a good model for your first scratch-built boat, maybe, because, you know, they're pretty banged up, eh? So if you do bang up work, then it's right up your alley. And it's right up my alley right now. So, okay, so I've made little marks here, 3/8 all the way along. I just eyeballed it from a photo. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw just lines like this. Okay, all the way down. Okay, just as register marks for these little 20 thou dowel strips, I'll show you. And I've laid them on here like this, you see? Okay, so that's going to be, I'm going to sheet this over with 10 thou as a final sheeting. And I'm going to press that down and work it in just so that you get a hint of the you know, the big formers that are in behind this steel plate, like on the bow, because it's all sheet steel welded, like on the inside. So, and then there's outside weld or iron or steel ribbing too, right, which will go on later. But that way it'll give this a real battered up look. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some really thick plastruct, like this stuff here. I have some bottles I say that are really thick and goopy, and I'm going to just paint it on, just so it gives a kind of a mottled kind of steel finish to it, okay? Okay, so now all the fun stuff, right? We're going to be distressing this hull. So what I've done is I've laid in the 15th thou sheeting over the ribs. It's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. And just so you know, this gap here is actually built in on the prototype. This top deck is heavy steel along with this rail, which is beefed up by 3 more steel extrusions and rubber tires, right? Because this is where the tugs take all their shear when they're pushing. They don't want to push on here. This is the hull, right? Like, they're not going to build this heavy like this because of weight. But this is going to be dinged up and scratched and dented, and there's ribs, like reinforcing ribs in behind this, and that's what these 20 thou rod strips I glued in are going to simulate once I sheet it one more time with 5 thou. Now I cut this out of paper, right? Just printer paper, trial and error, just to get it so I know it's going to fit when I wrap it. A bit of a curve there, see? But I'm not worried about this here because I'll show you how I'm going to deal with that. So now that I have that, I take it on my 5 thou, I just tape it on 4 corners or whatever, tape there on each end, and I trace it and cut it gently with a knife. And this is my plastic piece that I roughed up with sandpaper. What I'm going to do first is I'm just going to start it in the corner here. And now you want to be quite judicious, but also liberal, if that, excuse me, makes any sense, when you put the cement on, because you want it to melt in really good. And if you see the hull on this tug, my goodness, it's covered in war wounds. Like, no matter, like every single photo, like even when they paint it, it's all bumpy and full of you know, damage and stuff and weathering. See, it's squeezing out there, oozing out nice. That's what I want. And this bow stem I can clean up later, but it's actually pretty beat up too, the bow stem. It's solid steel or iron probably. Okay, so I'm going to get that so it sits nice and tight under there like that. And then I'm going to be lifting it every couple of ribs to get glue under there and to push it down and let those ribs, they'll start to show through. You'll see, because the glue will melt this. It won't melt it completely, but it'll soften it and melt it enough that it'll start to show, and you'll see, and it's really cool. And then when it's dry, I'll be able to wet sand it, distress it, and run those other like half rounds rail up here and really do the side like the prototype. You can see all the ribs here. See all that? That's what I'm doing. And then I'll wet sand it. It's not as much down here because this is the water line right here through here. This is like I'm working up to here forward. This I'm doing later on another component of the build back this way, but this is when I want to get all this established here. See how there's steel rails in here, like see how it comes out quite a ways here? Okay, but there's all these sort of ribs showing through the plate steel here, and that's what I'm after. It's funny, you know, we build models and we want them to be nice and smooth, but when you build a tug, you want to introduce all kinds of surface anomalies deliberately. So it's, you know, you're modeling it, right? So what I'm going to do is once that's dry, I like to let it set good. I can almost start now with it, is I'm going to get quite a bit of glue just up underneath the first 2 sections, okay? And I like to use the Plastruct like an older bottle where it's thicker and goopier, not where it's really thin. I want it kind of goopy, Like you can always tell with this because it gets kind of cloudy there. And it gets goopy, which is perfect for this kind of thing. And then what I'm going to do is I can feel them, you know, those ribs in there. So I'm going to start pushing down. See, like that, it gets soft. I'm just going to start rubbing that in gently, but just with some force, pressure. And then I'm going to, like, it'll soften a bit more. And I'm going to use the tip here and just put some dents in and stuff. Some, you know, big creases, and, you know, just let that have its way there with the wooden tool. This is just a little sculptor's tool. You can get it at any art supply store. I love these tools. They're so handy. Or you can use this kind of tool. And this has got a sort of a rounded kind of anvil on it. And you can do interesting kind of marks and dents with this as well. And you want to maybe keep a lot of this damage more to the front of the bow. I've got a mark down here. And I'm going to really ease off on the rib defining by the time I get down to here, because it smooths out a bit more once it gets past the forecastle. So that's what I'm going to do. So you can work this for quite a while. You can see it showing through there, the rib. All right. And then what I want to do is just slowly work it down a couple at a time. Get lots of glue under there. Just lift it gently. Don't fold it back. You don't want to snap it off. Okay. And I like to do 2 at a time, but if you're not comfortable with 2, just try 1. You know, it's amazing when you scratch build. This is the kind of thing you can do that's available to you when you scratch build, is these opportunities. I mean, you probably wouldn't do this to a kit, right? So when you're scratch building it yourself, you're the modeler. You're making the model. You're not building the model, you're making it. Okay? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work that all the way down, and then I'll show you how I deal with this gap under here. Okay, so this 5 thou sheet is laid on now, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it to dry overnight, this part, because there's a lot of glue under there and I want it to be nice and hard in the morning. And then I can clean up the bottom nice and flush, and then I'll be able to wet sand it a little bit. But we'll have a look at it once it's dry. Sometimes I like to just coat it with glue as well, because it helps to kind of mottle the surface like steel. But I don't know if I really need to do it in 1/87 scale, but you never know. You just got to go with what you feel. So that's pretty good there. Now I'm going to show you how I deal with this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this right here. Extra heavy molding paste. I bet you a lot of modelers don't use this stuff. So this is acrylic, right? So I can just take this and I can lay it on really thick, okay? I'm going to fill in that gap under there. It's water-based, it's easy to use, it packs in thick, and it's smooth. I just love it for this kind of thing, and it loves plastic too, especially scored plastic. And I'm just going to slather that in there, is the term I like to use. Put in a good generous amount. That would have just been solid steel anyway. Okay, see how easy that was? Again, hashtag golden, no sponsor, but I love their stuff, right? Their molding paste, acrylic, right? Compatible with plastic, water-based, water-soluble. And you can smooth it beautifully with a wet brush. Oh, it's lovely stuff. You can actually mold with it. You can make molds with it, and you can shape it into thick, heavy build up and shape it later. Although it takes a while to cure if you want to sand it, like about, oh, I don't know, 3 or 4 days. But I like to leave, like in particular situations, I'll just put it where I don't have to worry about it for a long while. So that's done there. You can see, okay, the whole forward part is all done, the distressing part. And the rear deck is done. There's camber in there, and then I'm going to build the camber on this main deck because it will come back. Oops, sorry, I bumped the camera there. This will be the rear deck like this, okay? The fun is just starting now, okay? Okay, so I just want to point out a couple things here. So when you apply really thin evergreen sheet, like 10 thou, and most notably 5 thou thin, right? It's very thin when I covered this. When you put this solvent on, whether it's MEC or any kind of solvent, okay? Plastic solvent, cement. It's going to have varying sort of effects, but it will slowly, depending on the amount, like you get a feel for it, but it's always a little bit of a you know, just trial and error kind of thing. And you can't really go wrong if it's a ship hull you want, you know, whatever happens is going to be okay. Like I found that once I put tape on it, after I'd laid this on and there's a lot of glue still underneath here. Well, not a lot, but you know, like it's hot underneath this layer a little bit. And when I pulled the tape off, it left some interesting perforations on the metal, which I found to be interesting. But these are kind of the things that happen when you sort of go for that effect, right? So I just slathered this down with solvent over top and like on both sides and let it sit overnight. So now it's nice and hard. Like this was actually movable. It was springy because it's very thin, but now it's really hard and nice and super thin. This is another reason why I love, especially building ships with, well, anything for that matter, but ships mostly for scale steel and stuff. It's the perfect medium to build with. So once this is dry, it's nice and hard. So all your little melty perforations that you know, kind of put into the model and so on, you know, with your tools, tool marks, etc. It's all nice and hard now. So what I want to do is I just want to feather down some of this oil canning along the waterline a bit. Like I don't want it to look like symmetrical. So I'm just taking some emery cloth. Like in this case, I believe this is, well, it's just called coarse. And then this is medium. So I'm just going to gently knock it down some. And then I'll wet sand this later. I'm going to knock some of that down. Just to feather it out just a bit, okay? And because there was a lot of cement here, it melted, it actually welded the sheets together. So you shouldn't get you know, like orange peel or layers coming away. Where in some cases you might want that for just, you know, like erosion and decay and rust and so on. Because you'll get that with multiple layers sometimes. But this was a pretty good weld, and even if you do, like if you get a little bit of the top sheet sort of popping up, just dab in some solvent and press it in and it'll just re-weld nice, okay? Okay, I just want to briefly mention this now just to finish off this surface. You know, after using the emery, which knocks it down quite nicely, some of this oil canning effect more to the waterline. I just want to wet sand, and I have 2 grits here. And I've mentioned this before. You can get this from hobby stores. Like I know I have some from Japan, Tamiya, but I don't think it really matters. I think if you go to an automotive store and just get, you know, get 400, 600, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. There's 5 grits that's probably good to have in your kit. And I'm just going to go from the emery to the 600 wet and then the 1000. Just to knock down some of the, the scratches, because the paint will pick that up. And even though some of them might be desirable, I don't want it to look like that. So just a nice little wet sand, just to, maybe remove some of those scratches where all your perforations and dents and we'll just call it battle damage is going to be prominent still. It doesn't take much, really. Just give it a nice rub. You can see here too, I'll just point out that the extra heavy molding paste that I put in there is starting to harden up. This will take about a week, but it's not going to go anywhere. And while you're working on the model, it'll be nice and hard. That's the beauty of acrylic paste for filler. Yeah, it takes a while to cure, but when it does, boy, does it ever grab onto plastic well and takes paint well, and you can actually cut it and carve it too. It's not hard like epoxy, like brittle. So, and the shrink rate is fairly minimal when you use acrylic fillers and paste. So just going to rub it down and then hit it with some 1000. But you can see the wooden base there and see the nice seam here. That was from CA, just bonding to that Varathane. Once again, you get a beautiful finish here. Let me just mention one thing quick here too while I'm thinking here. Like I've heard people say things like, oh, I'll never be able to model like that or anything. Look, don't think that way. Like be encouraged. Like if you saw some of my early models, like you'd laugh, right? I mean, we all have to start somewhere. And if you just build it in like to your hobby, I mean, if you have 4 or 5 hobbies, well, I'm sorry, I can't help you. But if you're focused in on one primary hobby and you're willing to devote time to it, right, at the cost of maybe sacrificing some of the others, then you will get this good. Like you will get this confident, okay? Because it's inevitable, because humans are like that. And everybody manifests their own style. I'm a rather sort of shoot from the hip, be carefree, learn and process kind of modeler. I always have been. Yes, I've built from blueprints and plans, but those days are over for me. I don't want to do that anymore, and I don't have to. It's just for me, and I want a generally good, authentic model. I don't have to worry about all the, minuscule, 6 inches or 3 inches in scale on the model so much, because this is going to be similar like that. It's going to vary, but I don't care. As long as it has a nice representation of the Seaspan Corsair, I'll be happy. So you just be willing to put some time into it, accept your fail and your errors, because we all do them, and just keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and eventually you'll come up with a really nice model, and then the next one and the next one and the next one, because each model is some form of progression to the next, and then you end up with, a pretty good model in the end anyway, okay? All right? Okay, so notice that this here now, this is 15 thou. I just cut a strip from this, and I'm going to start completing the outer waterline surface of the tug here. Now this here is, see this line here? You see where I cut it off? This is where I'm going to join the next run, but it'll have to be done in a series of sections, because the side of the hull does this kind of compound curve inward to the deck here. It's well, you'll see it in some of the photos. So I'm going to build up to the water, or sorry, the deck level here where there'll be scuppers. And I'm going to use 15 thou. Now you can see this is actually 20. This is 15 plus 5, so it's 20. So I'm going to add this in. And the thing is with a boat like this, I don't like to say boat, I'd rather say ship, but we'll just call it tug or whatever, or I'll just use whatever term comes to mind at the time. And I'm going to wrap it. So I'm going to use CA on here, just along the bottom half here. Okay, and then I'll just flood in some solvent from this angle on the top to get a nice weld. That way I can decide to put the next top piece of the cap that goes around here. And then I'll just knife off. I made this a little bit wider. Right, I want to overlap it a bit so I get a nice clean line on the water line here. So I just want to make it a little bit wider, just, you know, for error. Okay. I just want to mention about CA for a second here. Like, as most of you know, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I just don't like it. Like, for example, like when it works and if it's applied right, it's a necessary evil, I call it. Well, it's a great glue. Listen, most of the old sci-fi movies, like for example, Star Wars, like a lot of their model ship, or sorry, their spaceship models, everything would never have been built on time without this. This actually came, this technology, I believe, came out of, I'm not sure now, I can't recall whether it was Europe or Japan or something, but when Lauren Peterson, he was the chief head honcho for the model and effects department during a lot of the Star Wars movies, epics that were made. And he discovered this like in the industry and brought it in, and it just sped up production like tenfold, you know. But then a movie model is only made to last under a lot of intense lights and heat for, you know, a few days, or a 2-minute shot, 10-second shot, whatever, and then they're thrown in the back of the studio and that's it. Maybe restored, maybe thrown out, maybe trashed, who knows. But when we build these kind of models, these static display, we want them to last, right? So I find with CA, like I never use accelerator. Like I used it in the film industry for model making too, but I never used accelerator. I hated that. I just hated that stuff. Anyone that sprayed it around me, I just moved away or moved my bench or told them to go away, because there's no need for it. Like if you use fresh bottles of CA, like try to get the half-ounce ones. Unfortunately, I think everybody knows that now, because they go flat after a while. But if you use Varathane on wood, for example, right? And I know I harp on this, it's a marriage made in heaven. So I'm just going to wrap this and I like this pick because it's curved and it's like a little dam. I can pull the CA around nicely, and when it dries, I just scrape it off with my knife, and then I'm always aware of the integrity of my pick. So this gets wrapped around, and I'll worry about the compound curve later because it's the stern. I'll have to cut a couple of relief cuts down here to tuck it. But I just want to make sure that I get a good wrap there. And then I can clean this up later and sand it. Okay. Okay, so just chasing the top seam now from plastic to plastic. So this sheet 15 thou is welded to the wood sub base. So now, like, this was left like a little bit loose, like some of the CA seeped in there, but that's okay, right? But see there the gap in here? So what I'm going to do is just come in here with some solvent. I'm just going to flood it in like a capillary in there. And then I'll just push that in. Just hold it for a bit. It works pretty fast, this solvent, actually. Once the chemical bond activates, and because it has a high evaporation rate, it grabs right away, almost like CA, but far better than CA, obviously. Because why? Because it's a chemical bond, not a mechanical bond. All right, so we've combined the two of them here, haven't we? And once the whole ship is skinned, then it doesn't really matter about the wood. Oh yeah, don't let me forget. So let me just zoom out for a second. So some would say, well, why don't you just build the whole ship on plastic? Well, okay, you can, but if you do, don't cry to me when it warps, when it deflects like this. After you start building the upper structure, it'll pull it and it'll bend it up. That's what'll happen. This is I think most advanced modelers or scratch builders know this, that if you don't have a solid base to build on, you'll end up with a warp and you'll never be able to get it out because it'll be built in. Because the plastic, when you're bonding and pulling parts and there's a little bit of shrinkage, and then you're pulling parts into place, this will never stay straight on the bottom. Unless it was, laminated, 3 pieces of 80 thou with weights and so on. But even then, there's going to be flex to it where there isn't so much with a 7-ply Baltic birch. That's why I like to build over Baltic birch, because once it's varathaned on both sides, Baltic birch, like it's not moving. Like that's why you pay for it, because it's, top grade laminate, right? I've never had any warp. Like over 30 years, 40 years, I've had models and stuff, and it's straight as an arrow. Like a lot of my cutting plywoods. It's straight as an arrow. It's been in outside, it's been in my open garage, etc. It just stays straight, right? As long as it's sealed on both sides or unsealed. But if you seal one side, it will deflect over time. Okay, so when you do seal plywood, make sure you do both sides and the edges, or don't do it at all. Okay, but in this case, you need to varathane it to increase the adhesion rate in terms of a mechanical bond from plastic to wood.